A poisonous centipede crawling on a pristine white carpet. That's all it took to destroy 3 lives. While his wife sat in a hermetically sealed hotel room, scrubbing her hands raw with sanitizer in terror, he was out in the savage storm, covered in red mud and sweat, cheating on her with a woman who smelled like the earth itself. He thinks he's found freedom, but he doesn't know that the clean, cold world he left behind is preparing a punishment far worse than death. Watch closely, because the shower at the end washes away much more than just dirt. Inside the hotel suite, an artificial winter reigned supreme, defying the geographical reality that burned just beyond the walls. The air conditioning unit hummed with a relentless, monotonous persistence, forcing a steady stream of frigid air across the room to pool in the corners. It chilled the heavy, starch-stiffened sheets of the king-sized bed, making the expanse of white linen look more like a frozen tundra than a place for rest. The room was hermetically sealed, a fortress of beige and cream designed to repel the chaotic vibrancy of the continent outside. There was no humidity here, only a dry, recycled chill that settled deep into the bones, making the skin feel tight and the lungs ache with every shallow breath taken in this expensive vacuum. Seated deep within the plush embrace of a velvet armchair, the woman looked small and defensive. She had pulled her legs up beneath her, minimizing her physical contact with the furniture as if the upholstery itself might harbor microscopic threats. Her hands moved with a frantic, rhythmic precision as she rubbed a clear antibacterial gel into her palms and fingers, coating them in a chemical shield. The sharp, clinical odor of rubbing alcohol rose in the air, aggressively overpowering the delicate, sweet scent of the tropical lilies that the housekeeping staff had placed in a crystal vase on the mahogany coffee table earlier that morning. She refused to even look at the flowers, let alone touch them, treating the arrangement with deep suspicion. In her mind, the vibrant orange petals were not decorations but potential Trojan horses, likely concealing ants, spiders, or something far worse within their velvet folds. To her, this entire country was a biological hazard waiting to breach her defenses. She muttered to herself about the tap water, repeating the warning she had read in the guidebooks like a mantra for salvation. It was poison, she insisted to the empty air, unfit even for rinsing a toothbrush, necessitating a fortress of plastic mineral water bottles she had arranged on the nightstand. The man stood with his back to her, facing the floor-to-ceiling panoramic window that offered a safe, detached view of the world. Through the thick, double-paned glass, the city below looked like a hallucination shimmering in the heat. It was a landscape of rusted corrugated iron roofs, dusty palm trees, and red earth that seemed to pulse with a feverish intensity. The glass was soundproof, effectively slicing away the reality of the scene. He could see the traffic, the throngs of people, and the wind whipping the trees, but he heard nothing. It was like watching a violent, colorful television program with the volume muted, rendering the struggle for life outside merely decorative. He buttoned his shirt slowly, his eyes tracing the chaotic lines of the streets below while his body remained trapped in the sterile aquarium of the room. He felt a strange dissociation, as if he were a diver in a shark cage, separated from the ocean by mere inches of steel and glass. His wife's voice drifted to him, not as a conversation, but as background noise, a stream of anxieties that had no bearing on the world he was watching. She was talking about breakfast, insisting that they must order room service because the main dining hall was surely infested with flies that carried terrible diseases, and she refused to expose herself to such risks. When she asked if he would be back soon, her voice held a tremor of genuine panic at the prospect of being left alone in this foreign land. She reminded him, for the 3rd time that morning, not to eat anything sold by street vendors and to keep his hands away from his face to avoid infection. He nodded without turning around, a mechanical gesture of appeasement that cost him no effort. Turning away from the window, he picked up his leather folder from the desk, checking to ensure his documents were in order. He felt a sudden, desperate need to be on the other side of that door, to breathe air that had not been scrubbed of all life. His hand closed over the cold metal of the door handle, the physical connection to his escape. He paused, not out of affection, but out of habit, and glanced back over his shoulder at the room. It was a tableau of supreme, expensive isolation. His wife was still scrubbing her hands, her eyes fixed on a spot on the wall, her mind likely cataloging the potential bacteria on the remote control. The room was perfectly still, a white box of silence. Then, his gaze drifted downward to the expanse of the pristine, cream-colored carpet that stretched between the door and the armchair where she sat curled up. There, stark against the perfect whiteness of the wool, something moved. It was a large, black centipede, segmented and armored, a prehistoric visitor that had somehow navigated the chemical barriers and the hermetic seals. It was nearly 6 inches long, its many legs rippling in a hypnotic wave as it navigated the fibers of the rug. It was barely a yard away from the chair where his wife sat, oblivious and terrified of the invisible, while the very real monster approached her sanctuary. The creature paused, its antennae twitching as if tasting the alcohol-saturated air, deciding on its path toward the warmth of the chair. The man stood frozen for a heartbeat, his eyes locked on the dark silhouette of the insect. It was a messenger from the world outside, a small fragment of the chaos he had been watching through the glass. He looked at the centipede, and then he looked at his wife's pale, sanitized face. A shout would save her. A step forward would crush the threat. Instead, a strange, cold calmness settled over him. He said nothing. He did not gasp. He simply turned the handle, opened the heavy door, and slipped out into the corridor, leaving the two of them alone together in the silence. The descent in the elevator felt less like a simple change in floors and more like a decompression sequence between two incompatible worlds. He stood alone in the mirrored box, watching the illuminated numbers tick downward in slow, rhythmic succession, counting away the safety of the air-conditioned sanctuary he had just left. The stainless steel walls reflected a distorted version of himself, a man in a crisp, expensive linen suit that was already beginning to feel like a costume for a play that had been cancelled. The silence here was absolute, a heavy, manufactured quiet that pressed against his ears, carrying the faint, chemical scent of industrial lemon cleaner. It was the smell of the West, of safety, of insurance policies and sterilized surfaces, and for a moment, he felt a sudden, irrational desire to hit the emergency stop and rise back up to the artificial winter where his wife sat guarding her perimeter against the invisible. But gravity pulled him relentlessly downward, and with a soft, pneumatic sigh, the doors slid open to reveal the lobby. Even here, inside the hotel's grand atrium, the atmosphere had shifted. The air was still cool, but it was thinner, laced with the comings and goings of luggage porters and the frantic energy of arriving guests. He walked across the polished marble floors, the sound of his leather soles clicking sharply against the stone, echoing like gunfire in a canyon. The staff at the front desk nodded politely as he passed, their smiles fixed and professional, masking whatever thoughts they held about the transient ghosts who haunted their halls. He approached the revolving glass doors, the final membrane separating the controlled environment from the untamed reality waiting outside. The glass spun with a heavy inertia, and he stepped into the pie slice compartment, moving his feet to the rhythm of the machine. As the revolving door swept him through its cycle and deposited him onto the pavement, the physical shock was instantaneous and violent. The heat did not merely rise, it attacked. It struck his face like a solid object, a heavy, suffocating pillow of humidity and temperature that seemed to have physical weight. In the span of a single breath, the cool dryness of the hotel room became a distant memory, replaced by an atmosphere so thick it felt as though he were inhaling warm water. The air was dense and cloying, instantly causing his shirt to cling to his back and beads of sweat to prickle along his hairline. It was an aggressive, uncompromising climate that demanded submission, stripping away his composure before he had even taken 3 steps away from the entrance. Waiting for him at the curb, idling with a rough, throaty rumble, was an old, battered Jeep that looked as though it had survived several wars and 1,000 storms. Its paint was faded and scratched, telling stories of bush thorns and gravel roads, a stark contrast to the gleaming black limousines that usually idled in the hotel driveway. Behind the wheel sat a driver whose face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, his hands resting casually on the worn steering wheel. But the man's attention was immediately drawn to the figure standing beside the vehicle, leaning against the dusty fender with a relaxed grace that made the chaotic street seem suddenly arranged around her. It was the translator, the woman he had briefly met the day before, though in this light, she seemed like an entirely different creature. She wore a dress of simple cotton, dyed a rich, deep ochre that seemed to have been birthed directly from the red earth of the continent. It was a color that did not fight the dust or the sun but embraced them, making her appear as an extension of the landscape itself. The fabric draped loosely over her frame, hinting at a strength beneath the softness, fluttering slightly in the hot breeze. Her skin, exposed at her arms and neck, gleamed in the merciless sunlight like dark, polished bronze, radiating a vitality that made his own pale complexion feel sickly and translucent. When she saw him, she pushed off the fender and straightened, offering him a smile that contained no trace of the servile politeness he had grown accustomed to from the hotel staff. That smile was the first genuine thing he had encountered in 48 hours. It was not a mask of customer service, but a human expression of recognition, amused and knowing. It anchored him in the swirling confusion of the driveway. She gestured for him to take the passenger seat, speaking a few sharp words to the driver in a language that sounded like stones tumbling in a riverbed. As he climbed into the Jeep, the interior smelled of old leather, diesel fuel, and something faint and sweet, like dried grass. The engine roared to life with a shudder that vibrated through the metal floorboards and up into his legs, a mechanical heartbeat that felt wildly out of sync with the polite hum of the luxury sedan that had brought him from the airport. They pulled out into the flow of the city, and the world exploded into a cacophony that assaulted every sense simultaneously. The traffic was not a system of lanes and rules but a fluid, aggressive river of steel and willpower. Brightly painted minibuses, their sides emblazoned with slogans and portraits of pop stars, weaved dangerously between trucks overloaded with timber and livestock. Horns blared in a ceaseless, dissonant symphony, short impatient blasts, long melodic trills, and the deep, angry bellows of semi-trailers. It was a wall of sound that vibrated in his chest, drowning out any attempt at conversation, forcing him to simply watch the spectacle unfolding beyond the open window. Everywhere he looked, there was movement. The sidewalks were a blurred mass of humanity, a kaleidoscope of colors and textures. Vendors balanced impossibly large baskets of fruit on their heads, walking with a regal, upright posture that defied physics. Men pushed wooden carts piled high with scrap metal, their muscles straining under the sun. Women with babies strapped to their backs in vibrant cloth slings navigated the crush with serene focus. Rhythmic music thumped from the open windows of passing cars and roadside stalls, a heavy bass beat that seemed to synchronize with the pulse of the heat itself. It was chaotic, terrifying, and utterly mesmerizing. He felt a strange loosening in his chest, a cracking of the rigid shell he had worn since leaving the States. The translator sat beside the driver, but she turned frequently to point things out to him, her voice cutting through the noise with surprising clarity. She did not offer the dry, historical facts of a tour guide. Instead, she narrated the life of the street. She pointed to a building and spoke of the corruption that built it, then to a tree and told a local legend about its roots. The wind whipped her hair around her face, but she didn't bother to smooth it down. She seemed to thrive in this chaos, drawing energy from the noise and the heat, while he felt like he was barely holding on. He realized, with a jolt, that his wife would have been screaming by now, terrified by the proximity of so much unwashed life, but he found himself leaning closer to the window, hungry for more. Suddenly, the Jeep swerved and slowed, pulling over to a crowded curb alongside a sprawling, open-air market. The translator explained that they needed water for the long drive ahead, as the supplies in the back were running low. Before he could protest or offer to pay the driver to go, she had already opened her door and stepped out into the fray. He hesitated for a split second, his wife's warnings about security and sanitation flashing through his mind like red warning lights, and then, driven by an instinct he didn't recognize, he opened his door and followed her. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, a patchwork of broken pavement and packed red dirt that instantly coated his polished Italian shoes in a layer of fine dust. The market was an assault on the olfactory nerves, a dense, layered fog of smells that made the air in the hotel room seem sterile and dead. The scent of roasting meat, goat, perhaps, or beef, sizzled over open charcoal fires, mixing with the heavy, sweet rot of overripe mangoes and crushed pineapples. Beneath that was the sharp tang of gasoline fumes from the idling traffic, the metallic bite of rust, and the unmistakable, pungent odor of human sweat. It was the smell of survival, of consumption, of life living and dying in rapid cycle. It was heavy and thick, filling his nose and throat, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was actually breathing, not just circulating air. He felt absurdly conspicuous in his tailored suit, a beacon of foreign wealth in a sea of daily struggle. The crowd was tight here, a solid mass of bodies moving in conflicting currents. People brushed past him without apology, their elbows and shoulders bumping against his ribs. He felt the dampness of their clothes, the heat of their skin. He was no longer a spectator behind glass, he was part of the organism. Panic flared briefly in his gut, the fear of pickpockets, of disease, of violence, but it was quickly subsumed by the sheer sensory overload. He looked for the translator, his only anchor in this storm, and found her a few steps ahead, carving a path through the press of bodies with the ease of a fish moving through water. She glanced back, checking on him, and seeing his hesitation, she slowed her pace, allowing him to catch up. When he reached her side, the crush of the crowd forced them together. Her shoulder pressed firmly against his chest, a solid, warm point of contact that grounded him. She didn't pull away. Instead, she used her body to shield him from a passing cart, guiding him toward a stall where a woman sat surrounded by stacks of plastic bottles. The physical intimacy of the moment was striking. He could smell the specific scent of her skin, not perfume, but something elemental, like rain on hot stones, and a hint of natural musk that was intoxicating in its honesty. They reached the stall, and she negotiated the price in a rapid-fire exchange of the local dialect that sounded like a song. He reached for his wallet, his movements clumsy and slow, but she shook her head, pulling a few coins from a small pouch at her waist. The vendor handed her 2 cold bottles, condensation dripping down the plastic. She turned to him, the crowd jostling them from all sides, enclosing them in a private, breathless bubble of space. The noise of the market seemed to fade into a dull roar, leaving only the 2 of them in sharp focus. She held out a bottle to him, her expression unreadable but intense. He reached out to take it. As his fingers closed around the cold plastic, they brushed against hers. The contact was brief, incidental, yet it sent a shockwave through his nervous system that was disproportionate to the action. Her palm was dry and incredibly hot, radiating a feverish warmth that seemed to burn through his skin. He noticed the texture of her hand, rougher than his wife's manicured softness, capable and strong. He saw her fingernails, cut short and kept clean, unadorned by varnish, practical and real. In that split second of connection, a current of electricity passed between them, a raw, silent acknowledgement that stripped away his title, his nationality, and his marital status. She did not pull her hand away immediately. For a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, she held her grip on the bottle, keeping their fingers locked in that accidental embrace. She looked up at him, her dark eyes locking onto his with a directness that stole the breath from his lungs. There was no subservience in that gaze, no deferential lowering of the lashes that he expected from a service worker hired by his firm. Instead, there was a challenge, a bold, unashamed assessment of who he was beneath the suit. Her eyes held a depth of ancient knowledge, a silent assertion that she saw through his disguise, saw the hunger he had been hiding even from himself. It was a look that terrified and thrilled him, causing his heart to skip a beat and then hammer against his ribs with a primitive, awakened rhythm. The city did not end abruptly, rather, it bled out slowly, its concrete veins tapering off into the raw, open wounds of the earth. The dense, suffocating grid of low-rise buildings and corrugated shacks gradually thinned, surrendering territory to the encroaching wilderness. The paved road, pockmarked and treacherous, eventually gave up its pretense of civilization and dissolved into a wide ribbon of beaten earth. They had crossed an invisible border, leaving the realm of human noise behind for a silence that was vast and ancient. The landscape opened up with a dramatic, breathtaking suddenness, revealing the savanna in all its harsh glory. It was a sea of tall, sun-bleached grass that shimmered like pale gold under the merciless noon sun, broken only by the silhouettes of acacia trees. These trees stood like solitary sentinels, their flat, spreading crowns looking like dark green umbrellas unfurled against a sky so blue it hurt the eyes to look at it directly. The jeep became a tiny, rattling vessel navigating a turbulent ocean of red dust. Every rut and pothole in the track sent a violent shudder through the chassis, tossing them in their seats with a jarring rhythm that made conversation difficult but physical awareness acute. The vehicle kicked up a billowing wake of crimson powder that swirled in the vacuum behind them, but plenty of it found its way inside the open cabin. The dust was inescapable, it was a living entity that settled on everything with a fine, persistent layer. It coated the dashboard, dulled the shine of the leather seats, and drifted onto their skin and clothes. Instead of brushing it away, the man watched it accumulate on the dark fabric of his trousers, realizing that for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the ruin of an expensive garment. He felt a sudden, claustrophobic need to shed the armor of his corporate identity. With clumsy, urgent movements, he shrugged out of his tailored suit jacket, tossing it carelessly onto the back seat where it landed in a heap, instantly forgotten. He fumbled with the cuffs of his dress shirt, rolling the sleeves up past his elbows, exposing pale forearms to the biting sun and the abrasive wind. He undid the top button of his collar, loosening the silk tie that felt like a noose, and took a deep, greedy breath. The air rushing through the window was hot and dry, tasting of grit and dry grass, but it felt cleaner than anything he had breathed in the hotel. He liked the way the wind slapped his face, stinging his skin, and he relished the sensation of the fine silica dust gritting between his teeth. It felt as though a layer of dead skin was being scrubbed away from his body, taking with it the accumulated numbness of 20 years of boardrooms and business lunches. The shell of the civilized executive, the man who worried about quarterly projections and mortgage rates, was cracking and peeling off in the African wind. He leaned an arm on the doorframe, watching the horizon blur, feeling a strange, wild exhilaration rising in his chest. The vibration of the engine, the heat, the dust, it all combined into a sensory assault that forced him to be present in the moment. He was no longer a spectator watching the world through a screen or a window, he was physically colliding with it, and the impact was jarringly pleasant. Beside the driver, the translator turned in her seat to face him, her posture relaxed despite the violent motion of the car. She began to speak about the land passing by, her voice a low, resonant contralto that seemed to vibrate in the small space of the cabin. She told him about the seasons, explaining how the scorched, golden wasteland would transform overnight after the first heavy rains. She described a green so violent and rapid it seemed like magic, a resurrection that happened every year. But now, she said, it was the time of waiting, the season of thirst. Her English was impeccable, yet it carried a cadence that was entirely her own, stretching the vowels and softening the consonants until the words felt round and heavy, like smooth river stones. He found himself listening less to the information she was conveying and more to the music of her voice. He watched her profile as she spoke, mesmerized by the line of her jaw and the curve of her neck. The heat in the Jeep was intense, and he could see small beads of perspiration gathering at her temples and sliding slowly down the side of her neck to vanish into the hollow of her collarbone. There was something incredibly raw and honest about her sweat. It wasn't the nervous, clammy sheen of a stressed executive, but the natural reaction of a body in tune with its environment. She did not wipe it away or apologize for the heat, she simply existed within it, as much a part of this landscape as the termite mounds and the dry riverbeds. In the midst of this sensory immersion, a thought of his wife flickered through his mind, unbidden and jarring. He pictured her back in the hotel, sealed inside that hermetic cube of chilled air, likely sitting on the edge of the bed with the remote control in a plastic bag. She seemed suddenly absurd to him, a fragile, pale creature designed for a different atmosphere, completely incapable of surviving here without a life support system of air conditioning and sanitizers. She was like an astronaut stranded on a hostile planet, terrified of the very air, while he was discovering that he could breathe it. The contrast was sharp and painful. His wife was a monument to preservation and fear, a static object, while the woman sitting in front of him was kinetic, alive, and vibrating with the energy of the earth. The Jeep lurched suddenly as the driver slammed on the brakes, responding to a sharp command from the translator. The tires skidded on the loose gravel, and the vehicle came to a halt in a cloud of its own dust. "Look," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. She pointed toward the horizon, where the shimmering heat haze distorted the shapes of the land. He squinted against the glare, following the line of her finger. There, moving with slow, majestic indifference against the backdrop of the endless sky, was a herd of elephants. They were gray, monolithic shapes, drifting through the golden grass like ghosts from a prehistoric era, their size rendering them surreal at this distance. They opened the doors and stepped out of the vehicle, needing to see this without the barrier of dirty glass. The moment the engine died, a profound silence descended upon them, heavy and absolute. It was not the empty silence of a soundproof room, but a vibrant, ringing silence composed of a million unseen insects and the pressure of the sun itself. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders, baking the earth beneath the soles of his shoes. The air shimmered around them, distorting distances, making the elephants appear to float just above the ground. He stood there, feeling small and insignificant in the face of such vastness, stripped of his importance, just another animal standing on the savannah. She moved closer to him, stepping into his personal space with a fluidity that felt entirely natural. She raised her hand again to point out the matriarch of the herd, her arm extending so that it was almost brushing against his chest. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of her directly to him. It was a complex, intoxicating smell that bypassed his logic and went straight to his limbic system. She smelled of the dry earth, of the sun-warmed dust, of a deep, natural musk, and beneath it all, a faint, sweet note that reminded him of wild vanilla or dried bark. It was the scent of the place itself, distilled into human form, and it made his head swim with a sudden, dizzying rush of adrenaline. She lowered her hand but did not step back. Slowly, she turned her head, and they were suddenly standing face to face, inches apart in the middle of nowhere. The vast emptiness of the savannah surrounded them, creating a paradoxical sense of intimacy, as if they were the only two people left in existence. The rigid structures of their relationship, client and service provider, married men and employee, foreigner and local, evaporated instantly in the heat. There were no contracts here, no social norms, no witnesses but the silent giants on the horizon. The wilderness had stripped away the polite fiction of their interaction, leaving only the raw, biological reality of a man and a woman standing on burning earth. He looked into her eyes and saw that the professional mask had completely dissolved. Her pupils were dilated, swallowing the darkness of her irises, wide and black like deep wells. In that gaze, he saw a reflection of his own sudden, terrifying hunger. She was not surprised by the proximity, she was waiting for it. She felt the heavy, suffocating tension just as he did. It was a mutual recognition of an impending collision, a realization that the polite world was thousands of miles away and irrelevant. This was not a frivolous flirtation or a calculated seduction, it felt like a command from the land itself, a primal imperative that demanded submission. The call of the wild was thrumming in the air between them, louder than the blood pounding in his ears, and he knew, with a mix of terror and relief, that he was going to answer it. The transformation of the sky was not gradual, it was a violent seizure of the heavens. The relentless, blinding blue that had dominated the day was suddenly strangled by a bruised purple darkness swelling rapidly from the east. Great, swollen clouds, heavy with the promise of a deluge, rolled over the savannah like an invading army, devouring the sun in a matter of minutes. The golden light that had bathed the grasslands turned into a strange, metallic gray, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to distort the shapes of the acacia trees. The temperature dropped with a shocking suddenness, the air shifting from a dry oven heat to a cool, pressurized heaviness that pressed against the eardrums. It was as if the entire landscape was holding its breath, bracing for an impact that was both inevitable and terrifyingly powerful. The driver, a man who had likely seen 1,000 such storms sweep across these plains, glanced up at the roiling sky with a practiced eye. He muttered something in his local dialect, a low, rhythmic phrase that sounded like a prayer or perhaps a curse, and then gestured toward the jeep's rear tires. With a nod of professional discretion that bordered on complicity, he announced he needed to check the suspension and secure the canvas flaps before the wind hit. He walked away, rounding the vehicle and effectively making himself invisible, granting them a circle of privacy in the middle of the wilderness. It was a tactical retreat, a silent permission for them to step away from the machine and into the raw atmosphere of the gathering tempest. They walked away from the track, moving toward a cluster of high, dense shrubbery that stood 100 yards off into the bush. The pretext was flimsy, ostensibly, they were there to survey the sight lines for a potential construction project, to see how the land lay for the foundations of a lodge that would never be built. But neither of them spoke of business. The folders and blueprints had been left behind on the leather seats. They walked with a unified purpose, drawn not by the geography of the land but by the magnetic pull of the storm and each other. The wind began to pick up, whipping the tall grass around their legs and tearing at their clothes, carrying with it the scent of ozone and distant lightning. The first drops of rain did not fall, they struck the earth like bullets. They were large, heavy, and cold, exploding against the parched red soil with audible slaps. In an instant, the air was filled with a scent so powerful it caused the men to stumble. It was the smell of petrichor, the release of oils from the dry earth meeting the rain, but here, it was amplified 1,000 times. It smelled of ancient dust, of thirsty roots, of life waking up from a coma. The scent rushed into his lungs, hitting his brain with a force stronger than any alcohol he had ever consumed. It was a narcotic, dizzying and primal, stripping away the last layers of his rationality and replacing them with a singular, throbbing instinct. She stopped and turned to face him, the wind whipping her ochre dress around her legs like a flag. The first heavy drops had already darkened the fabric across her shoulders, making the material cling to her skin. She looked at him, and for the first time, the veil was completely gone. There was no question in her eyes, no hesitation, no professional distance. There was only a dark, dilated invitation, a fierce recognition of the hunger that had been building between them since the moment they met in the lobby. Her gaze was direct and unblinking, challenging him to cross the final distance, to abandon the safety of his hesitation and step into the fire that was burning despite the rain. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly not from cold, but from a surge of adrenaline that made his heart hammer against his ribs. When his fingertips brushed the skin of her arm, he expected coolness from the wind and rain. Instead, she was burning. Her skin radiated a feverish, intense heat that seemed to defy the elements, a biological fire that scorched his touch. The contrast between the icy bite of the falling rain and the furnace of her body sent a shockwave through him, short-circuiting his nervous system. It was an electric connection that felt less like a caress and more like grabbing a live wire, dangerous and agonizingly necessary. Then the heavens opened fully, and the world was erased by water. The rain did not just fall, it fell in a solid, gray sheet, a torrential downpour that instantly soaked them to the bone. In any other circumstance, the logical reaction would have been to run, to sprint back to the shelter of the jeep, to laugh nervously while drying off with towels. But neither of them moved a muscle to flee. They stood rooted in the mud, staring at each other while the water plastered his shirt to his chest and ran in rivers down her face. The civilized world would have demanded they seek cover, but the civilization in him had been washed away. They were no longer tourists or observers, they were participants in the storm. Nature roared around them with a violence that vibrated in the marrow of his bones. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a sound so loud it felt like the sky was being torn in half, followed instantly by the blinding strobe of lightning that bleached the color from the world. The wind howled, bending the tough scrub bushes nearly flat against the mud, tearing leaves from branches and sending them spiraling into the dark air. The chaos was absolute, a symphony of destruction and power. In the midst of this fury, their stillness broke. He stepped forward, or she did, it was impossible to tell who moved first, and they collided with the same force as the storm front meeting the heat. There was no tenderness in the way he took her, no gentle exploration or romantic whispers. It was a desperate, starving collision of bodies. She dug her fingers into his shoulders, her nails biting through the wet fabric of his shirt, anchoring him to her as the mud grew slippery under their feet. Her head was thrown back, exposing her throat to the rain, and she was shouting something, whispering fiercely into the gale. The words were in her native tongue, guttural and rhythmic, unintelligible to him but perfectly understood on a visceral level. They sounded like incantations, like the voice of the earth itself speaking through her, urging him on, demanding everything he had. The sounds of their breathing were harsh and jagged, mixing with the relentless drumming of the rain and the rolling thunder. He felt powerful, terrifyingly strong, as if the energy of the lightning was channeling directly through his limbs. He was rough, urgent, driven by a thirst that had been denying itself for a lifetime. He wasn't the man who checked spreadsheets or worried about cholesterol, he was a creature of muscle and instinct, grappling with another creature in the mud. The rain acted as a lubricant and a shroud, washing away the sweat as fast as it formed, creating a slick, friction-filled universe where only sensation existed. In this vortex of sensation, his previous life didn't just fade, it ceased to exist. The image of his wife, sitting in the sterilized, air-conditioned hotel room with her hand sanitizer and her fears, dissolved like watercolor paint in a flood. She was a ghost, a fiction from a boring book he had once read. The contracts, the business deal, the return flight, they were meaningless concepts from a dead world. There was no hotel. There was no America. There was only this wet, violent present, the smell of crushed grass and ozone, and the woman who felt like she was made of the same hot earth that was currently turning to mud beneath his boots. He realized, with a flash of clarity that was as bright as the lightning, that he was terrified. He was terrified because for the first time, he was touching something real. He had spent his life in climate-controlled boxes, protected from the dirt and the bugs and the heat, and now he was drowning in them, and it felt like being born. The woman in his arms was not just a lover, she was the avatar of the continent he had been afraid of. By entering her, he was finally entering Africa, surrendering his detachment. It was an act of submission disguised as conquest. He was merging with the place that had threatened to consume him, and as the storm raged on, he let it take him completely, leaving the white American businessman dead in the mud. The return journey began in a silence that was heavier and more profound than the one that had accompanied their departure. The storm, which had raged with such apocalyptic fury only moments before, ceased with a jarring suddenness, as if a celestial switch had been flipped. The heavy gray curtain of rain lifted to reveal a world that had been scrubbed raw and renewed. Steam began to rise immediately from the black asphalt of the road, curling upwards in ghostly, serpentine ribbons that danced in the humid air. The heat of the earth, temporarily suppressed by the deluge, was already fighting its way back to the surface, creating a mist that blurred the edges of the acacia trees and turned the distant hills into soft, watercolor shapes. It was a surreal, dreamlike landscape, a transitional zone between the violence of the storm and the inevitable return of the sun. As they drove west, chasing the retreating clouds, a rainbow erupted against the slate-gray horizon. It was not the delicate, pastel arc of a children's storybook, but a vibrant, aggressive band of color that seemed to burn with its own internal light. The red and the violet were so intense they looked almost solid, a bridge of pure energy arching over the broken landscape. The man stared at it through the windshield, his eyes wide and unblinking. He felt as though the optical phenomenon was a signal meant specifically for him, a cosmic validation of the boundary he had just crossed. The world outside the Jeep was vast, wet, and breathing, a stark contrast to the small, dry life he had been living up until this afternoon. He lowered his gaze from the horizon to his own hands, which were resting on his knees. They were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the aftershocks of a massive release of tension. Under his fingernails, there were crescents of dark, rich mud, remnants of the earth he had clawed at during the height of the storm. He stared at the dirt with a sense of wonder, as if it were gold dust. It was physical proof of his contact with reality, a souvenir that he had no desire to wash away. For years, his hands had known only the smooth plastic of computer keyboards, the dry paper of contracts, and the cold glass of tumblers. Now, they carried the DNA of the continent, and the sight of that grime filled him with a strange, fierce pride. He looked down at his clothes. His expensive dress shirt, tailored in Italy and meant for boardrooms, was ruined. It was plastered to his chest, translucent with water and stained with irregular maps of red clay and crushed green vegetation. One of the buttons was missing, torn off in the frenzy, and the collar was askew. In any other context, this disarray would have been a source of deep shame and anxiety. He would have worried about the judgment of others, about the loss of his professional armor. But here, in the rattling cabin of the Jeep, the ruined shirt felt like a vestment of initiation. He had shed the skin of the corporate drone and emerged as something rawer, something that didn't mind the stain of living. A profound exhaustion settled deep into his muscles, but it was unlike any tiredness he had ever known. It was not the hollow, grinding fatigue of jet lag or the stress-induced lethargy of a long week of negotiations. This was a good, solid weight, a heaviness that felt earned. His limbs felt loose and warm, his chest expanded easily with every breath, and his mind, usually a hive of buzzing anxieties, was quiet and clear. He felt the specific satisfaction of a body that has been used for its intended purpose. He closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the ache in his shoulders and the thrumming of his blood, realizing that he felt younger than he had in a decade. Beside him, the translator was also adjusting to the aftermath. She sat with her posture slightly slumped, the rigid grace of her professional demeanor temporarily suspended. She was wringing water from the hem of her ochre dress, her movements efficient and unhurried. Her hair was damp, clinging to her forehead in tight coils, and she pushed it back with a casual hand. She did not look at him, nor did she speak. There was no need for words. The silence between them was not empty, it was a dense, fibrous thing that bound them together. It was the silence of accomplices, of two people who have shared a survival experience and are now inextricably linked by the secret of what they have done. He watched her profile, the way the late afternoon light caught the high curve of her cheekbone. He realized with a jolt of panic that he could not simply go back. The idea of returning to the hotel, of riding the elevator up to that hermetically sealed room, felt physically repulsive. He pictured the white sheets, the hum of the air conditioner, the smell of sanitizer, and his wife sitting in the armchair terrified of a spider. That world seemed to belong to a stranger, a man he had left behind in the mud. He could not lie down in that sterile bed and pretend that he hadn't just been baptized by the storm. He was different now. Africa had entered his bloodstream, acting like a virus that rewrote his genetic code. His mind began to race, not with business strategies, but with frantic, impossible plans. He started constructing scenarios in which he didn't have to leave. He would tell his wife that the business negotiations had hit a snag, that he needed to stay another week, another month. He would find an apartment in the city, something with open windows where the dust could blow in. He would figure out a way to keep the translator by his side, to explore this new version of himself that she had unlocked. It was a delusion, a fever dream born of adrenaline and dopamine, but in the enclosed space of the Jeep, it felt like the only logical path forward. He felt he had discovered the key to happiness, a chaotic, dirty, vibrant freedom that he was desperate to hoard. The Jeep began to slow as the traffic thickened. The vast emptiness of the savannah gave way to the sprawling outskirts of the capital. Shacks made of tin and wood crowded the roadside, smoke rising from cooking fires. Then came the concrete buildings, the billboards, the congestion. The sun had set behind the clouds, and the city lights were flickering on. To his eyes, adjusted to the wild gloom of the storm, the electric lights looked garish and sickly. The neon signs buzzed with a false, chemical cheerfulness. The headlights of the oncoming cars were aggressive glares. The civilization that he was returning to felt like a cheap imitation of life, a plastic replica compared to the elemental fire that was still burning in his gut. The noise of the city began to invade the cabin, replacing the memory of the thunder. Honking horns, shouting pedestrians, the grind of engines, it all sounded discordant and hostile. He felt a rising sense of claustrophobia as the buildings grew taller and closed in around them. The Jeep, which had felt like a capsule of freedom in the open plains, now felt like a cage being transported back to the zoo. He wanted to shout at the driver to turn around, to drive back into the darkness until they ran out of gas, but he sat frozen, gripping the door handle, watching his new reality recede in the rearview mirror as the old one rushed up to meet him. They turned the final corner, and the hotel loomed ahead like a fortress of glass and steel. It stood apart from the chaos of the street, set back behind high walls and security gates. It looked impregnable, a monument to exclusion and comfort. The sight of it filled him with a sudden, sharp despair. It was the physical manifestation of the life he was trying to escape, a towering reminder of his obligations, his marriage, and his cowardice. The driver steered the Jeep up the sweeping driveway, the tires crunching on the pristine gravel, a sound that felt obscenely loud in the quiet of the luxury enclosure. The vehicle came to a smooth halt under the massive portico, bathed in the warm, golden glow of the architectural lighting. The contrast was jarring, the muddy, battered Jeep sitting amidst the polished limousines and valets in white uniforms. He felt exposed, a dirty intruder in the temple of wealth. He knew that the moment the door opened, the spell would be broken. He would be Sir again, the client, the husband. He turned desperately to the woman beside him. He needed to say something, anything, to bridge the gap between the mud and the marble. He wanted to tell her that this wasn't the end, that she had changed him, that he would come back for her. He opened his mouth, his heart pounding in his throat, searching for the words that could anchor the storm in the present. He wanted to grab her hand, to feel that heat one last time. But before a sound could escape his lips, the exterior world intervened with brutal efficiency. A uniformed doorman, smiling his vacant, professional smile, pulled the passenger door open. The barrier was breached. A blast of air-conditioned air from the lobby rushed out to meet them, carrying the scent of expensive lilies and floor polish. It hit his face like a slap, dry and chilling, instantly drying the sweat on his forehead and reminding him of the sterile winter waiting upstairs. The woman did not look at him with longing. She did not wait for his declaration. As the cold air hit her, she seemed to shrink back into herself, rebuilding her defenses in the span of a heartbeat. She gathered her small bag, smoothed the wrinkles in her dress, and turned to him. The fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by a dull, opaque surface. She gave him a short, sharp nod, the universal gesture of a subordinate acknowledging a superior. It was a dismissal, a closing of the account. Her face was once again an impenetrable mask of professionalism, leaving him sitting alone in the back seat, covered in mud, with his words dying unsaid in his throat. The ascent in the elevator was a slow, silent journey of dislocation, a physical rising that felt perilously like a spiritual descent. He stood in the corner of the brushed steel box, watching the illuminated floor numbers count upward, each digit carrying him further away from the vibrant, chaotic earth he had just touched. He felt like an intruder in his own body, a vessel that had been filled with a raw, electric energy that did not belong in this vertical coffin. He breathed in deeply, trying to trap the scent of the storm within his lungs, fighting to retain the smell of the ozone, the wet red clay, and the musky, vanilla sweetness of the woman's skin. These were the only souvenirs he had, invisible artifacts of a reality that was already beginning to fade under the onslaught of the hotel's aggressively neutral atmosphere. The elevator hummed with a smooth, soulless efficiency, erasing gravity, erasing the struggle, lifting him effortlessly back toward a world where sweat was a failure and dirt was a sin. When the doors slid open on his floor, the corridor stretched out before him like a tunnel in a hospital ward, silent, carpeted, and infinitely long. The air here was not just cool, it was dead, scrubbed of all organic matter and scented with a synthetic lavender that stung his nose. He walked heavily, his boots leaving faint, damp impressions on the plush runner, feeling a profound sense of trespass. He was a creature of the mud now, a man who had howled in the rain, and he was walking into a sanctuary built to keep nature at bay. He reached the door of his suite and hesitated, his hand hovering over the key card reader. He expected to find the room dark, the curtains drawn against the night. He imagined his wife asleep, or perhaps sitting passively by the television, bathed in the blue glow of a news channel, waiting for him to return and validate her boredom. He prepared a lie, a simple excuse about a breakdown or a detour, something to bridge the gap between his transformation and her stasis. The electronic lock clicked with a soft, judgmental beep, and the heavy door swung open on silent hinges. The scene that greeted him was so sharply at odds with his expectation that he stopped dead on the threshold. The room was not dark, it was blazing with light, every lamp and overhead fixture illuminated to banish even the smallest shadow. And it was not peaceful. The space was a flurry of organized chaos. 3 large, hard-shelled suitcases lay open on the luggage racks and the bed, their silk linings exposed like the bellies of dissected animals. Piles of clothes were stacked with military precision on the duvet, ready to be packed. The air did not smell of sleep, it smelled of nervous energy and the sharp tang of victory. Standing in the center of this activity was his wife, and she was not the fragile, frightened woman he had left hours ago. She was fully dressed in her traveling suit, a beige ensemble of wrinkle-resistant fabric that looked as crisp as if it had just come from the dry cleaner. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, tight bun, not a single strand out of place, and her face was set in a mask of rigid determination. In one hand, she clutched her smartphone like a weapon, with the other, she was aggressively folding a silk blouse. When she turned and saw him, dirty, soaked, and breathing hard, her expression flickered. It was a complex grimace that combined deep physical revulsion with a strange, cold triumph. She did not ask if he was okay. She did not ask why he was wet. She simply pursed her lips, creating a thin line of disapproval, and looked at his muddy boots standing on the carpet. "We are leaving," she announced, her voice crisp and devoid of hysteria, the voice of a project manager handling a crisis. "Right now. Tonight. I have the car coming in 45 minutes, and our flight is booked for 2 in the morning." She didn't wait for his reaction, didn't leave room for a question. She began to pace around the suitcases, ticking off her accomplishments on her fingers. She explained that she had gone to the front desk immediately after finding another insect. She didn't specify what, just that it was crawling, and had unleashed absolute hell upon the management. She had threatened lawsuits, bad press, and corporate boycotts. She had terrified the duty manager so thoroughly that they had not only refunded the entire stay but had paid for the first-class upgrades on the flight home just to get her to stop screaming. He stood dripping on the entryway tiles, water pooling around his feet, listening to the cadence of her voice. It was a wall of sound, impenetrable and self-assured. She spoke of the hotel as if it were a gulag, a place of filth and danger that they had narrowly escaped. But then, she stopped packing for a moment and turned to him with a look of supreme satisfaction, the look of someone who has tied up every loose end. She dropped the phone into her purse with a casual clatter and crossed her arms. "And don't worry about that guide agency," she said, her tone shifting from defensive to vindictive. "I took care of that, too. I called your office, and I called the local firm that provided that woman." His heart hammered against his ribs, a sudden, violent thud that had nothing to do with the storm. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice sounding raspy and weak in the acoustic deadness of the room. She smiled, a tight, humorless stretching of the lips. "I reported her," she said simply. "I told them she was completely unprofessional. I told them she was erratic, that she took you off the agreed route, and that she put a senior executive in danger." She picked up a stack of underwear and jammed it into a suitcase corner. "And I told them she appeared to be under the influence. Drunk, or drugs, I don't know. It doesn't matter. I told them she was slurring her words and acting aggressive. I demanded she be fired immediately and blacklisted. They apologized profusely. She won't work with decent people ever again." The words hit him like physical blows, harder than the rain, harder than the thunder. He stood frozen, his mind reeling with the horrific injustice of it. He heard the sound of a life shattering, not his, but hers. The woman who had shown him the elephants, who had touched his hand in the market, who had pulled him into the storm and awakened his soul, she was being erased. His wife, from the safety of this air-conditioned fortress, had reached out with a phone call and destroyed a livelihood, destroyed a reputation, all because of a centipede and a need for control. He knew the accusation of drugs in this industry, in this country, was a death sentence for a career. It was a wolf ticket, a mark that would follow her forever. He opened his mouth to speak. The truth was right there, burning on his tongue. He could scream it. He could tell her that the translator was the only professional person he had met. He could tell her that there were no drugs, only the intoxication of the rain. He could shout that he had been a willing participant, that he had wanted the danger, that he had slept with her in the mud and that it was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He could forbid her from leaving. He could call the agency back right now and take the blame. He could save her. The moral imperative was screaming in his head, a siren of guilt and outrage that demanded action. He took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, ready to shatter the peace. But then, his eyes drifted past his wife's angry face to the bed. He saw the crisp, white sheets that were waiting beneath the piles of clothes. He felt the dry, cool air of the conditioner soothing his heated skin. He looked at the minibar, the thick curtains, the soft lighting. He visualized the argument that would follow his confession, the screaming, the tears, the calls to lawyers, the frozen assets, the public humiliation, the messy, exhausting dismantling of his comfortable life. He saw the long, hard road of divorce, the loss of his reputation, the uncertainty of a future built on a moment of madness in the mud. He looked at Africa through the window, dark, wild, demanding, and then he looked at the sweet, safe, sterile, predictable. The fire in his gut flickered and died, extinguished by the heavy blanket of his own cowardice. The siren in his head fell silent. He realized, with a crushing clarity, that he was not the man he thought he was in the Jeep. He was not a creature of the earth. He was a soft thing, grown in a greenhouse, and he could not survive outside. He looked at his wife, who was waiting for a fight, waiting for him to defend the savage, and he simply exhaled. His shoulders slumped. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay. I'll get ready." The surprise on her face was fleeting, replaced quickly by the smugness of a confirmed victory. She turned back to her packing, dismissing him, having won a battle she didn't even know she was fighting. He walked past her, careful not to let his muddy sleeve brush against her clean suit. He entered the bathroom and locked the door behind him, leaning his forehead against the cool wood for a long moment. Then, he moved to the mirror. The face looking back at him was streaked with red dust, the eyes wild and bloodshot, the hair matted. It was the face of a stranger, a man who could have been happy. He looked at this reflection with a deep, mourning sadness, and then he turned away. He began to strip off the ruined clothes. The shirt, stained with clay and grass, fell to the tiled floor with a wet slap. The trousers followed, heavy with the weight of the adventure. He kicked them into a corner, a pile of dirty laundry that would be left for the maid, a mess for someone else to clean up. He stepped into the shower stall, a glass enclosure that was as sealed and separate as his life. He turned the handle, and the water poured down, hot and plentiful, filtered and pressurized. He stood under the spray, closing his eyes as the heat hammered against his skin. He watched the water swirling around his feet. At first, it ran red, thick with the dust of the savannah, swirling with the particles of the earth he had tried to claim. It carried away the scent of the rain, the smell of the musk, the trace of the vanilla perfume. It washed away the evidence of his infidelity and the physical proof of his awakening. He stood there for a long time, scrubbing his skin until it was pink and raw, scrubbing until the water ran clear again, washing away the dirt, the memory, and the last stubborn remnants of his conscience.